There I was, sitting peacefully at Gate A12 in Denver International Airport, reading my book and waiting for my flight to Seattle, when this woman in a $300 blazer marched up to me like she owned the airline. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "but you're in my seat." I looked up from my paperback novel, confused. "I'm sorry, what seat?" She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the window seat I'd been occupying for the past 20 minutes. "7A, that's my assigned seat, and I need you to move." Now, let me be clear about something. I'm 64 years old, I've been flying for 40 years, and I know the difference between a gate area seat and an airplane seat. But this woman was standing there with her boarding pass held out like it was a court summons, tapping her designer heel against the airport carpet. That's when I looked at her boarding pass and realized something that would make this whole confrontation absolutely delicious. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning and tell you how a simple flight to visit my son turned into the most satisfying public takedown I've witnessed since my teaching days. My name is Patricia, and if you knew me, you'd know I'm not the type to look for trouble. After 32 years of teaching high school English, I've seen every kind of entitled behavior imaginable. I learned long ago that sometimes the best response to a bully is patience, observation, and letting them hang themselves with their own rope. This particular Thursday morning in October, I was flying from Denver to Seattle to help my son Michael and his wife prepare for their first baby. At 7 months pregnant, Jessica was having trouble with the nursery setup, and Michael, bless his heart, has never been handy with anything more complicated than a screwdriver. The flight was scheduled to leave at 9:15 a.m., which meant I'd been up since 5:30 to make sure I got to the airport with plenty of time. At my age, rushing through security isn't an option. My knees remind me of every football game I attended, every classroom I paced, every year I've been blessed to live on this earth. I'd specifically requested seat 7 of the window seat because I love watching the landscape change as we fly. There's something about seeing the country from 30,000 feet that puts life in perspective. Mountains, plains, cities that look like circuit boards from up high. It's one of the simple pleasures I allow myself when I travel. My boarding pass was safely tucked in the front pocket of my purse, right next to my reading glasses and the baby booties I'd knitted for my soon-to-be grandson. Everything was organized, planned, and peaceful. That should have been my first warning that something was about to go wrong. I'd arrived at the gate about 45 minutes before boarding, found a comfortable seat with a good view of the departure board, and settled in with my book, a mystery novel I'd been saving for the flight. The gate area was filling up with the usual mix of business travelers, families, and fellow retirees like myself. That's when she arrived. I noticed her before she noticed me, which would prove to be fortunate. She was probably in her late 30s, dressed in what I recognized as expensive professional attire. The kind of outfit that screams, "I make more money than you," without saying a word. Her hair was pulled back in one of those severe buns that looks uncomfortable but apparently conveys authority, and she was carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. She was also on her phone, speaking loudly enough for everyone within a 15-foot radius to hear about some important client meeting in Seattle and how this flight absolutely could not be delayed because she was too valuable to keep waiting. I did what any reasonable person would do. I minded my own business and tried to focus on my book. But there was something about her energy that felt familiar. It was the same restless, entitled energy I used to see in parents who thought their child's poor grade was somehow my fault, or students who believed the rules didn't apply to them because they were special. After about 10 minutes of listening to her phone conversation, during which she managed to complain about everything from the airport coffee to the inferior business travelers around her, she hung up and began surveying the gate area like a general inspecting troops. That's when her eyes landed on me. More specifically, they landed on the seat I was occupying. Now, I need to explain something about gate seating at airports. It's first come, first served. There are no assigned seats in the waiting area. You find an empty spot and you sit. It's been that way since commercial aviation began. Everyone knows this. Everyone except this woman, apparently. She stood up from her seat about 10 feet away and walked toward me with the kind of purposeful stride I'd seen 1,000 times before. It was the walk of someone who was about to make unreasonable demands and expect compliance simply because they asked. "Excuse me," she said, and I could already hear the false politeness that people use when they're about to be rude, "but you're in my seat." I looked up from my book, genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry?" "That's my seat," she repeated, pointing at the chair I was sitting in. 7A, I need you to move. That's when she held out her boarding pass like it was some kind of legal document. And that's when I saw it. The boarding pass in her hand clearly showed seat 23C, not 7A, not even close to 7A, row 23, seat C. The middle seat, about as far from the window as you can get on a commercial airliner. But here's the thing, I didn't say anything immediately. 32 years of teaching had taught me the value of letting people dig their own holes before you fill them in. I think there might be some confusion, I said calmly, closing my book but keeping my finger on the page. This isn't an airplane seat. This is just a waiting area chair. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of irritation that crossed her face. I always sit in 7A when I fly. That's my seat. Always sits in 7A. Interesting claim. Ma'am, I said gently, gate seating is first come, first served. But if you'd like to sit near the window, there are several empty seats over there with a nice view of the tarmac. I gestured toward a row of completely empty chairs about 20 feet away, all of which had the same view she seemed to be craving. That's when she made her critical mistake. Look, lady, she said, and the fake politeness evaporated like morning dew. I don't think you understand who you're dealing with. I fly first class twice a month. I have status with this airline. I don't sit in random seats with random people. First class twice a month. Status with the airline. These were interesting claims from someone holding a boarding pass for seat 23C. But I still wasn't ready to play my hand. I'm sure the airline appreciates your business, I said, maintaining my calm tone. But I'm comfortable here, and I don't see any reason to move. Her face went through a series of color changes that reminded me of a mood ring. First confusion, then surprise, then the deep red of someone who isn't used to being told no. This is ridiculous, she declared, loud enough for surrounding passengers to start paying attention. I need that specific seat for my pre-flight routine. Pre-flight routine. In a gate area chair. This was getting better by the minute. That's when she decided to escalate things in the most predictable way possible. I'm getting the gate agent, she announced, as if this was some kind of threat that would make me quake in my comfortable walking shoes. I watched her march over to the gate counter, her heels clicking against the airport floor in an angry staccato rhythm. The gate agent, a patient-looking woman named Sandra, according to her name tag, looked up with the expression of someone who deals with passenger complaints all day long. I couldn't hear the exact conversation, but I could see the woman gesturing dramatically in my direction while Sandra maintained professional composure. After about 2 minutes of what appeared to be increasingly heated discussion, both women started walking toward me. This was about to get interesting. Ma'am, Sandra said as she approached, I understand there's some confusion about seating? The woman jumped in before I could answer. This passenger is refusing to give me my assigned seat. I specifically requested 7A, and she won't move. Sandra looked puzzled. Ma'am, seat assignments are for the aircraft, not the gate area. Passengers can sit anywhere they'd like while waiting to board. But I always sit in that specific spot, the woman insisted. It's part of my travel routine. I need to be oriented properly before boarding. I had to admire Sandra's patience. She'd probably heard every excuse and demand in her years of gate duty, but this one seemed to be testing even her professional limits. I understand you have preferences, Sandra said diplomatically, but gate seating is available to all passengers on a first-come, first-served basis. However, I'd be happy to confirm your actual seat assignment on the aircraft. That's when things got really interesting. Sandra looked at the woman's boarding pass, and I saw her eyebrows raise slightly. It was the same expression I used to get when a student handed in a book report on a book that didn't exist. Ma'am, your boarding pass shows seat 23C, that's in our main cabin, toward the rear of the aircraft. The woman's face went through another series of color changes. There must be some mistake. I specifically booked seat 7A. I always book 7A. Sandra checked something on her mobile device. I'm showing seat 23C on your reservation. Would you like me to see if there are any available upgrades? I don't need an upgrade, the woman said, her voice getting higher. I need my correct seat assignment. Someone obviously made an error when they processed my ticket. Now, I'd been listening to this entire exchange with growing amusement, but something was bothering me. The woman kept insisting she'd booked seat 7A, but her boarding pass clearly showed 23C. Either she was confused about what she'd booked, or she was deliberately lying to try to get a better seat. That's when I decided to take a closer look at her boarding pass. And that's when I saw something that made this whole situation absolutely perfect. "Excuse me," I said, speaking up for the first time since Sandra had arrived. "I couldn't help but notice your boarding pass. Would you mind if I asked you a question?" The woman turned to me with barely concealed irritation. "What? Your boarding pass shows today's date, correct?" She looked down at it, then back at me. "Of course it does. And it shows flight 447 to Seattle, departing at 9:15 a.m. "Yes, obviously." I smiled the same patient smile I'd perfected over 3 decades of teaching. "Ma'am, I think you might want to look at that boarding pass a little more carefully." Sandra was watching this exchange with curious interest, probably wondering where I was going with this line of questioning. The woman looked down at her boarding pass again, and I watched her face change as she realized what I'd spotted. The boarding pass was dated for the wrong day. Not today, tomorrow. She was trying to board a flight that wasn't leaving for another 24 hours. She started, then stopped, staring at the boarding pass like it had personally betrayed her. Sandra gently asked, "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass?" With trembling hands, the woman handed it over. Sandra looked at it, then at her device, then back at the boarding pass. "Ma'am, this boarding pass is for tomorrow's flight. Today is Thursday, October 15th. This boarding pass is dated for Friday, October 16th. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a boarding announcement from 3 gates away. But it gets better. While Sandra was examining the boarding pass more closely, I caught a glimpse of something that made the situation even more delicious. The boarding pass wasn't just for the wrong day, it was for a completely different airline. "Ma'am," Sandra said gently, "this boarding pass is also for Southwest Airlines. This is a United flight." Wrong day, wrong airline, but she'd been absolutely certain that she always books seat 7A and that I was somehow stealing her rightful place. The woman stood there holding her incorrect boarding pass, surrounded by a growing audience of passengers who had stopped their own pre-flight activities to watch this drama unfold. The confident, entitled demeanor she'd worn like armor just minutes before was cracking like ice on a warm day. Now, you might think this would be the moment when the woman apologized, laughed at her mistake, and quietly slipped away to figure out her travel situation. If you think that, you don't know entitled people very well. Instead, she doubled down. "This is impossible," she declared, loud enough for half the gate area to hear. "I made these reservations weeks ago. Someone has obviously tampered with my boarding pass." Tampered with her boarding pass to change both the date and the airline. Sandra maintained her professional composure, though I could see the strain around her eyes. "Ma'am, boarding passes are generated directly from the airline's reservation system. They cannot be altered by outside parties." "Well, something is wrong," the woman insisted. "I have an important meeting in Seattle this morning. I cannot be on the wrong flight." That's when I decided it was time to share what I'd been observing. "Ma'am," I said, standing up from my chair with the careful movements of someone whose knees have earned every creak, "I couldn't help but overhear your phone conversation earlier. You mentioned having an important client meeting in Seattle." She looked at me suspiciously. "So? Well, if your meeting is this morning, and your boarding pass is for tomorrow's flight, it seems like the problem isn't with the airline or with seating arrangements. It seems like the problem is with your travel planning." The color drained from her face as the implications hit her. Sandra, bless her heart, was trying to be helpful. "Ma'am, if you have a Southwest reservation for tomorrow, you might want to check if they have any flights departing today that you could switch to." But I wasn't done yet. 32 years of dealing with students who thought they could lie their way out of consequences had given me a pretty good radar for deception. And something about this woman's story still wasn't adding up. "There's just one more thing I'm curious about," I said, maintaining my friendly, grandmother tone. "You mentioned that you always book seat 7A, and that you fly first class twice a month with status on this airline." "That's right," she said defensively. "Well, I'm looking at my own boarding pass here," I said, pulling it from my purse. "And seat 7A is actually in the main cabin, not first class. First class on this aircraft would be rows 1 through 4. Sandra nodded. "That's correct. Seat 7A is a main cabin window seat." The woman's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She'd been caught in another lie claiming to fly first class while demanding a coach seat. But the best part was yet to come. A gentleman sitting nearby, he looked to be in his 50s, probably a frequent business traveler, spoke up. "Excuse me, miss, but I couldn't help overhearing. Did you say you always book seat 7A on this route?" "Yes," she said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "That's interesting," he continued, "because I fly this route every month for work, and I've had seat 7A reserved for the past 6 months. It's part of my corporate travel agreement with United." Oh, this was getting good. Sandra checked her device again. "Sir, you're correct. Seat 7A is indeed reserved under your corporate account for recurring monthly travel." The woman was now trapped in a web of her own lies. Wrong day, wrong airline, false claims about her usual seat, false claims about flying first class, and now evidence that she couldn't possibly always book the seat she was demanding. That's when the final piece of this beautiful puzzle fell into place. Another passenger, an older woman about my age, had been listening to the entire exchange. She approached our little group with the determined walk of someone who'd had enough. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I think I know this woman." All eyes turned to her. "Aren't you Janet Morrison, from the Morrison Travel Agency downtown?" The woman, apparently Janet, went pale. "I thought I recognized you," the older passenger continued. "You helped me book a cruise last year. Very professional, very knowledgeable about travel arrangements. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a plastic airline spoon. A travel agent, a professional travel agent who books trips for other people, had somehow managed to book herself on the wrong airline, for the wrong day, while claiming to be a frequent first-class traveler with a regular seat assignment that belonged to someone else." The gate area had fallen silent except for the background noise of airport announcements and rolling luggage. Janet Morrison, travel professional, stood in the center of what had become an impromptu theater performance, exposed as someone who couldn't even manage her own travel arrangements. Sandra, maintaining her professionalism despite what must have been a desire to laugh, offered what assistance she could. "Ms. Morrison, I'd suggest you contact Southwest Airlines to see about changing your reservation to today. Our flight is fully booked, so I won't be able to help you with a same-day change to United." Janet looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would step forward and offer her their seat, their ticket, or perhaps a time machine to undo the last 20 minutes of her life. Instead, she found 30-plus pairs of eyes looking back at her with expressions ranging from amusement to second-hand embarrassment. I need to make some phone calls," she mumbled, gathering her expensive briefcase and her incorrect boarding pass. "Ma'am," I called out as she started to walk away, "I hope everything works out with your client meeting." She turned back to me with a look that could have melted steel. "This is all your fault. If you had just moved when I asked politely." "Ma'am," I said gently, "I'm not the one who booked the wrong airline on the wrong day. I'm just a grandmother trying to get to Seattle to help my son set up a nursery." The business traveler who'd exposed her seat line nodded in agreement. "Lady, you've got some nerve blaming other people for your own mistakes." The older woman who'd recognized her as a travel agent shook her head. "Janet, I'm honestly shocked. When you booked my cruise, you were so careful about all the details. What happened here?" Janet had no answer. She turned and walked toward the Southwest Gate area, presumably to try to sort out her self-inflicted travel crisis. As she walked away, I heard her on the phone again. "This is Janet Morrison from Morrison Travel. I need to speak to someone about an urgent change to my reservation." Sandra watched her go, then turned to me with a smile that she'd been professionally suppressing for the past half hour. "Ma'am, I apologize for the disruption. Is there anything else I can help you with?" "Actually," I said, "I'm curious about something. The gentleman mentioned having a corporate reservation for seat 7A. I was wondering if there might be any other window seats available. I'd be happy to move if it would make his travel easier." The business traveler, his name was Tom, I learned, shook his head with a smile. "Ma'am, after what I just witnessed, I wouldn't dream of taking your seat. You've earned that window view." Sandra checked her system anyway. "Actually, we do have one first-class seat available if you're interested in an upgrade. Complimentary, of course, given the circumstances. A complimentary first-class upgrade. The universe certainly has a sense of humor." "That's very kind," I said, "but I'm perfectly happy with my window seat in 7A. I reserved it specifically because I love watching the landscape change during the flight." Sandra smiled. "Well, 7A is a great choice. You'll have beautiful views of the Rocky Mountains as we take off. As the gate area returned to normal pre-boarding activity, several passengers came up to thank me for handling the situation with such grace. The older woman who'd recognized Janet as a travel agent was particularly complimentary. "Honey," she said, "you handled that better than I would have. Where did you learn to stay so calm when someone was being so unreasonable?" 32 years of teaching high school, I replied. You learn to recognize when someone is digging their own hole, and sometimes the best thing to do is just hand them a bigger shovel. She laughed. Well, that woman certainly dug herself a deep one. When boarding finally began, I settled into my window seat 7A, the seat I'd legitimately reserved, paid for, and planned to enjoy. As the plane pushed back from the gate, I looked out at the Denver skyline and thought about the morning's events. Sometimes life gives you front row seats to watch karma in action. Janet Morrison, travel professional, had tried to bully a 64-year-old grandmother out of an airport chair based on lies, entitlement, and false claims about her travel status. Instead, she'd exposed herself as someone who couldn't even manage her own basic travel arrangements. The lesson, I suppose, is that the truth has a way of coming out, especially when you're dealing with someone who's been around long enough to recognize deception when they see it. As we climbed toward cruising altitude, I opened my book and smiled. Somewhere below us, Janet Morrison was probably still trying to sort out her travel crisis, maybe learning a lesson about the importance of checking your reservations before throwing your weight around. But the story doesn't end there. About an hour into the flight attendant, a kind woman named Carol who looked to be about my age, stopped by my row with the beverage cart. "Ma'am, I heard about what happened at the gate," she said quietly as she handed me my coffee. "Word travels fast among the crew. I wanted to thank you for handling that situation so gracefully." Apparently, Sandra had radioed ahead to let the flight crew know about the incident with the passenger who'd tried to board the wrong flight on the wrong airline. In the aviation world, stories like this become legend pretty quickly. "I also wanted you to know," Carol continued, "that woman showed up at the Southwest gate about 20 minutes after you boarded. She was arguing with their agents too, trying to claim she had special circumstances that required them to break their own policies." I raised an eyebrow. Did it work? Carol's smile told me everything I needed to know. Let's just say Southwest agents have heard every sob story in the book. She ended up having to buy a completely new ticket at full price for their next flight to Seattle, which doesn't leave until this afternoon. Full price. Last-minute booking. For someone who'd been bragging about her frequent flyer status and airline connections, this was probably a financial gut punch. "But here's the best part," Carol said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. She tried to use her travel industry credentials to get a discount. When they asked for her agency's corporate account information, it turns out Morrison Travel Agency has been in arrears with Southwest for 6 months. Unpaid bills. The plot thickened. A travel agent whose business was behind on payments, trying to throw her weight around based on professional credentials that apparently weren't worth much. So she's paying full fare on a flight that gets her to Seattle this evening instead of this morning? I asked. If she's lucky, Carol replied. That afternoon flight was already oversold. She's on the standby list. Standby. After missing her original flight due to booking the wrong day and wrong airline, Janet Morrison was now sitting in Denver International Airport, hoping for a seat on an oversold flight, having paid full price for the privilege of waiting around all day. Meanwhile, I was enjoying complimentary coffee at 30,000 feet, watching the Colorado landscape roll by outside my window. The universe really does have a sense of justice. As Carol moved on with her cart, I settled back into my seat and thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If Janet had simply found an empty seat in the gate area like any normal person, none of this would have happened. If she hadn't tried to intimidate me with false claims and fake authority, she might have quietly discovered her booking error and fixed it without public embarrassment. Instead, her entitlement and dishonesty had led to complete exposure in front of dozens of witnesses, financial consequences, and a day-long delay in her supposedly urgent travel plans. There's a reason I'd spent 32 years teaching teenagers about consequences and accountability. Actions have results, and sometimes those results are exactly what people deserve. About 2 hours into the flight, as we were crossing into Washington State, I noticed Tom, the business traveler with the corporate reservation for seat 7, walking back from the restroom. He stopped at my row and smiled. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about what happened at the gate, and I wanted to apologize." "Apologize? For what?" "For not speaking up sooner," he said. "I could see that woman was giving you a hard time, but I didn't want to get involved until she started making claims about always booking my seat. I should have said something earlier." I shook my head. "Tom, you have nothing to apologize for. Sometimes people need to expose themselves through their own behavior. If you jumped in too early, she might have found a way to redirect her anger toward you instead of digging herself deeper." He considered this. "You know, you're probably right. I've never seen someone so thoroughly caught in their own lies. Wrong day, wrong airline, wrong seat information, wrong claims about her travel status. It was like watching a masterclass in how not to behave in public." "The thing that struck me most," I said, "was how she immediately tried to blame others when her mistakes were exposed. First it was my fault for not moving, then it was the airline's fault for tampering with her boarding pass, then it was apparently everyone else's responsibility to accommodate her poor planning." Tom nodded. "That's exactly what bothered me about her attitude. No accountability whatsoever. I travel for business constantly, and I've made my share of booking mistakes over the years. The difference is, when I mess up, I own it and figure out how to fix it. I don't try to make it everyone else's problem." We talked for a few more minutes about travel experiences, and Tom shared some of his own horror stories about entitled passengers he'd encountered over the years. But he agreed that Janet Morrison's performance ranked among the most spectacular examples of self-destruction he'd witnessed. As he returned to his seat, I realized that this experience had given me more than just a good story to tell. It had reminded me that standing up for yourself doesn't have to mean being aggressive or confrontational. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be pushed around, tell the truth, and let other people's dishonesty speak for itself. The flight landed on schedule at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and I gathered my things with the satisfaction of someone who'd gotten exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they'd planned to be there. As I walked through the jet bridge, I thought about Janet Morrison, probably still sitting in Denver, wondering how her day had gone so wrong. At the baggage claim, even though I'd only brought carry-on luggage, I wanted to stretch my legs. After the flight, I ran into the older woman who'd recognized Janet as her travel agent. Her name was Dorothy, and she was visiting her daughter's family in Seattle, just like I was. "Patricia," she called out when she saw me. "I've been thinking about that woman all flight. I'm honestly considering finding a new travel agent after what I witnessed today." "What bothers you most about it?" I asked, curious about her perspective. Dorothy shook her head. "The dishonesty. When she booked my cruise, she seemed so professional, so detail-oriented. She caught every little error in the paperwork, double-checked every date and time. To see her make such basic mistakes with her own travel, and then try to lie her way out of it, it makes me wonder what else she might not be telling the truth about." That was a fair point. If Janet Morrison couldn't manage her own simple domestic flight reservation, how could her clients trust her with their complex international vacation plans? Plus, Dorothy continued, the way she treated you was just inexcusable. Trying to intimidate someone over an airport share? Making false claims about airline policies? I've been traveling for 68 years, and I've never seen anything like it. We parted ways at the airport exit, both heading to our respective family visits, both carrying the same story about karma in action. Michael picked me up at the airport in his new SUV, the one he'd bought in preparation for car seats and diaper bags and all the equipment that comes with a baby. His face lit up when he saw me, and I felt that familiar surge of maternal pride that never gets old, no matter how grown up your children get. "How was your flight, Mom?" he asked as we pulled away from the airport. "Educational," I said, settling into the passenger seat. "Very educational. That sounds like a story," he said with a grin. As we drove through Seattle traffic toward his house, I told him the whole tale, from Janet's initial demand that I move from my gate area seat, through all the layers of deception that got exposed, to her ultimate fate of being stranded in Denver with a standby ticket she'd paid full price for. Michael listened with the fascination of someone hearing a really good story, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "Mom," he said when I finished, "I can't believe you stayed so calm through all of that. I would have lost my temper when she started making false claims about airline policies." "Honey," I said, "after 32 years of dealing with teenagers and their parents, there's very little that can rattle me. The key is recognizing when someone is lying and having the patience to let them hang themselves with their own rope." But weren't you worried she might actually convince the gate agent to make you move? I smiled. Not for a second. I had my boarding pass, I knew the rules, and I could see she was making claims that didn't add up. The truth has a way of coming out, especially when someone keeps talking long enough to contradict themselves. When we got to the house, Jessica was waiting with a cup of tea and a hug. At 7 months pregnant, she moved with the careful grace of someone carrying precious cargo, but her smile was as bright as ever. "Patricia, thank goodness you're here," she said. "Michael has been trying to assemble the crib for 3 weeks, and I swear it has more pieces now than when he started." I looked at Michael, who had the sheepish expression of a man who'd been defeated by furniture assembly instructions. "In my defense," he said, "whoever designed that crib clearly has a degree in engineering and a sadistic sense of humor." As we settled in the living room to catch up, Jessica asked about my flight. I found myself telling the story again, and Jessica's reaction was even more animated than Michael's had been. She was a travel agent and she booked herself on the wrong airline for the wrong day? Jessica gasped. "That's like a chef poisoning themselves with their own cooking." "The best part," I said, "was watching her realize that everyone around her could see through her lies. When you're used to intimidating people with false authority, it's probably quite a shock to encounter someone who won't be bullied." "Where do you think she learned that behavior?" Michael asked. "I mean, people don't just wake up one day and decide to start making unreasonable demands of strangers." It was a thoughtful question, and one I'd been considering during the flight. "In my experience," I said, "people like that have usually been successful at intimidating others in the past. They've learned that if they act entitled enough, confident enough, demanding enough, most people will give in just to avoid confrontation. The problem comes when they encounter someone who won't play that game." Jessica nodded. "Like a bully who's never been stood up to." "Exactly like that," I agreed. "And just like with bullies, sometimes the most effective response is simply not to be intimidated. You don't have to fight back, you just have to refuse to back down when you know you're right." We spent the rest of the evening working on the nursery, and I'm happy to report that the crib was successfully assembled with no pieces left over. As I helped Jessica organize baby clothes and Michael figured out how to install the car seat properly, I reflected on how much more satisfying this was than sitting in an airport watching entitled people make fools of themselves. Although, to be honest, that had been pretty satisfying too. The next morning, over breakfast, Jessica brought up the airport story again. "Patricia, I keep thinking about that woman Janet, was it? Do you think she learned anything from what happened?" I considered the question while spreading jam on my toast. "In my experience, people like that rarely learn from consequences. They're more likely to convince themselves that they were the victim of unfair treatment than to examine their own behavior." "So you think she's telling people that the airline discriminated against her?" "I'd bet money on it," I said. "Right now, she's probably crafting a story about how she was mistreated by airline staff and bullied by unreasonable passengers. The fact that she booked the wrong flight on the wrong day will somehow become everyone else's fault." Michael shook his head. "That's depressing." "Maybe," I said, "but here's the thing, her ability to learn from the experience isn't my responsibility. My responsibility was to stand up for myself, tell the truth, and not let someone push me around based on lies." Mission accomplished. Jessica smiled. "I hope I handle situations like that as well as you do when I'm your age." "Honey," I said, "you'll handle them even better. You'll have the benefit of all the lessons I've learned, plus your own experiences, plus whatever wisdom your children will teach you along the way." Later that afternoon, while Michael was at work and Jessica was napping, I found myself thinking about the broader implications of the airport incident. In a world where people seem increasingly willing to lie, bully, and intimidate to get what they want, sometimes the most radical act is simply telling the truth and refusing to be moved by false authority. Janet Morrison had bet that an older woman sitting alone in an airport would be an easy target for her entitled demands. She'd calculated that I would be too polite, too intimidated, or too tired to push back against her claims. She'd calculated wrong. At 64, I'm old enough to recognize manipulation when I see it, experienced enough to spot lies when I hear them, and confident enough to stand my ground when I know I'm right. Those aren't qualities that come from reading about them in books, they come from decades of real-world experience dealing with people who think the rules don't apply to them. The satisfying part wasn't watching Janet get caught in her lies, though that was certainly gratifying. The satisfying part was the reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing is as simple as refusing to do the wrong thing. I didn't have to prove I was smarter than her. I didn't have to embarrass her in front of other passengers. I didn't have to be cruel or vindictive. I just had to sit in my legitimate seat, tell the truth when asked, and let her own dishonesty expose itself. Sometimes that's all it takes.